Good. How are you?
Good, good. Welcome to the Noble Pen Podcast. Thanks for being on.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, tell me a little bit about yourself. How'd you begin writing? How old were you? What inspires you to write?
Yeah, I don't know exactly when I started writing. I know that I have loved to write and read since I was really little. My mother taught me to read when I was about 4 or 5, maybe, and I probably started writing short stories around maybe 6 or 7.
Oh,
So
wow.
fairly young. But when I say short stories, I mean it was like really short stuff, maybe a page at most. And my mom included a lot of write to learn activities in our curriculum as well. I was homeschooled, so she had the leeway to do that. And so I was exposed to writing at the earliest age possible, pretty much.
Okay. And how old were you when you first published your first book then? Was that more recent or?
Um, the very first one I published, I want to say I was maybe 16 or 17. The book was not very good quality, so it's since been taken down and removed. I've learned a lot since then. I'd say the first thing that I have available that is out there for readers to actually purchase and read was published in 2019, I think. So a couple
Okay.
of years ago.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about a book that either A, you're currently working on or your most recent release, something that you would really want the viewers to get word out about.
Yeah, okay. I actually just finished the rough draft for a novel that I have coming up for release next year in June. So it's off with beta readers now. It's steampunk fantasy. It's my first steampunk, like full steampunk novel. I've not tried
Okay.
this particular
I
fantasy
hate to
genre.
interrupt. I hate to interrupt but this is something that's pretty good for the viewers here. Can
Yeah.
you explain steampunk fantasy? Because personally, I don't even really know what that
Sure.
really entails.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so some of the viewers might already be familiar with steampunk as a genre, but in case they're not, steampunk is essentially it's a historically based novel, but essentially it takes place usually in the Victorian period or the Wild West, depending on whether it's in America or England. And it's steam based inventions usually. So sometimes steampunk can include a fantastical element. So it's not so much sci fi as it is. People are using magic along with science in order to create things. So, like some of the ones that I've really adored when I read them took and used magic alongside steam powered inventions in order to create like Frankensteins and things. Like
Oh,
a
that's
lot of
cool.
times the villains in the novel are using mechanical like automatons, or they're creating like Frankensteins and they're using steam power and electricity to like bring the thing to life. So it's a lot of that kind of stuff set within the Victorian era. So it's essentially reimagining what would history have looked like if steam had been really taken off, been the thing at that particular time. Which we know obviously it didn't really in history. There were a lot of things that it was used for, but steampunk takes it way beyond what it historically was used for. Because how many different things can be imagined that could have been run off of steam? And then for steampunk fantasy, it adds the fantasy element in there, and you've got the magic, you have supernatural creatures. It really depends on the author. Mine veers more towards the supernatural creatures and magic being included in there. Uh, like I said, I'm new to steampunk, so I'm definitely the rough draft is going to need some adding in steampunk
Right.
elements because I was finding my feet in the first half, especially. Uh, but when you read a typical steampunk fantasy novel, it could be anything from paranormal side of fantasy to your more typical like epic fantasy type idea where you've got the big magical battles and things there. It just sort of depends on the author.
Okay. How do you go about your character development for this type of genre then, or even your setting? What do you draw on for that?
Yeah. Um, I don't know. Like for mine, it was kind of already figured out a little bit because this particular one was written for uh authors publishing group that I'm part of, and they sort of gave the general guideline that you could do any genre you wanted, but the main character had to be some sort of a mythological creature. And so at the time, I was looking at different creatures and what other people on the list had picked because they don't want doubles of anything. And I had been reading through a list of different Irish and Scottish legends because I have a lot of Irish and Scottish on my dad's side of the family, so I kind of wanted to give a nod to that heritage. And I ended up coming across a really interesting legend about this fairy queen with this harp that when it played, it was like harbinger of death. I thought that was a really unique concept. I hadn't seen, I guess, a lot of different mythology involving music or like musical instruments, although
Okay.
obviously banshees and the instrument of the voice being a harbinger of doom is obviously something I'd known. Um, so kind of after I picked that, the character just sort of started falling together. I did some research on the backstory from the myth for the original character, and then I kind of
Let me stop you there. I'm sorry. I don't mean to interrupt you, but I want to get you. You seem very insightful here, and I want to get the key points out, if that makes sense.
oh yeah, absolutely.
You said research. Now, how do you go
Yes.
about the research, and how do you know what information to use and what to leave out?
That's kind of a tricky process. It honestly takes a lot of practice. It's not something that necessarily just wake up and do. Um, I try to get a broad view of the topic first, and then if something catches my interest that seems like it would be really useful, um, for the direction that I'm thinking of for the story, then I'll try to delve into the details for that a little bit more
Okay.
to help me develop the story or the character better. But it kind of depends on the genre too, because with steampunk, you have a little more leeway to not be historically accurate because you're reinterpreting the historical era. So you have to be true to the genre requirements, like with anything, but don't necessarily have to have every single historical detail perfect, unless you are dealing with historical figures where it would need to be specific. But even there, you still have room. If you're writing historical fiction without the fantastical element, without the steampunk, it's just solid historical fiction, then you have to be a lot more specific about the details. And at that point, then it's really a balancing game of how much detail do I give the reader from what I know versus how much do I hold back because it would be overwhelming or it's not important to the current thing I'm writing about.
Right.
Enough detail in there that it feels realistic. Um, and it also depends on how historical you want your historical fiction too. If you want something like Jeff Shara, where it's basically like reading a biography of the historical event in a fiction format, you obviously need a lot more detail. There's a lot more you need to know because you're trying to avoid making anything up as much as possible. But if you're writing just general historical fiction, you can kind of cherry pick things. You might include some details that make the setting feel real and feel like that historical period. The foods, the appearance of the buildings, maybe historical events that were going on at the time. You can make mention of those. You could even include historical characters that were key, depending on the story. It all really depends on your story.
Okay. Very good. Tell me something that you've learned, like since you started writing, that you didn't know when you first started to kind of like help the viewers, like, hey, I learned throughout time to do this, not this.
Yeah. I don't know. There's so many things. Uh, I think like one big thing I learned in the publishing journey is don't publish something until it is truly 100% ready. And at the very beginning, that means you need to get outside perspectives. once you've got some experience under your belt, you'll start to get a sense for when a piece is genuinely ready and when it's not. But at the beginning, you don't necessarily have the objective tool set to evaluate your own work without the rose colored lenses. So it's easy to look at it and think it's good when in fact it's really not. And that's kind of, I did that. That was my first book. It was not ready for publication or for readers. I didn't have anyone's eyes on it. And so I didn't really understand that the storytelling itself wasn't great. Whereas if
Okay.
I had beta readers, that might not have been something I'd have done. I would have saved myself the disappointment of a lot of negative reviews on the book because of it.
Okay. And do you have readers now that you said you do have a list of beta readers that you send things to?
I don't have an established list. When I need beta readers, like with the one that I'm working on right now, because it's a new genre, I don't want to just go through the edit process on my own.
Mhm.
When I do need readers for that kind of a thing, I usually put it out there on my profile or in writing groups, and then reach out maybe to friends that I know enjoy the genre if I have anybody in mind.
Okay. Let me ask you this, because this is one that I've actually had some issues with myself as a writer. I'm just on my second book now, working on my third.
Okay.
And my question for you is, and this will help viewers as well, obviously, how do you know who to trust and who's not going to steal your work? Because I've seen a lot of things in posts like, hey, I just gave this out and now I seen somebody else wrote about. How do you know where to draw that line? Because that's tough.
Yeah. I haven't personally run into that yet, thankfully. But generally, with the beta reading side of things, I try to only pick people that I have had interactions with before or that come from groups where I know the members are trustworthy. Uh,
Okay.
if it's a group where I know there's 100 zillion members and I don't know anything about the people running the group, or I don't know that the reputation of the group is necessarily good, I won't just hand that out for beta reads. Arts readership is a little bit different. At
Okay.
that point, you're handing out finished, like obviously intended to be published pieces. You're
Yeah.
handing out advanced copies of the book essentially in exchange for reviews. But even there, I usually do it through a review service. So if they're not on my newsletter list or are not friends that I know, they're acquaintances because friends can't review on Amazon. But if I don't know that, at least have a reason to think that they're trustworthy, I will not hand out the art copies to them either, unless it's through a review service where they vet the people signing up, and if the person's done that kind of a thing, boost.
Okay. Okay. I got another question for you. This one's maybe a little off subject, but I'm trying to make the podcast. Obviously, I started this up myself. I was talking to a couple buddies at work about it, and they thought it was a great idea because they're authors themselves as well. But I'm trying to make it a little more interactive, a little bit more fun. So I had an idea, and I'm going to ask every person that I interview from this point going forward until I maybe decide to look at the laws of it first off, and secondly to implement it. What's your thoughts on like an author game show type situation? Like, what if, like, say I invited you on in a week or two from now, a few weeks, whatever, and I got another like Mariah. I don't know if you watched her video with me. She's fantastic. And I put both you guys up against each other, and I say, okay, I'm gonna list this many titles. You got to tell me who the author is, and then at the end, like everybody gets a point, obviously, for whoever said the author first. And at the end, the winner that has the most points, maybe say 20, whatever, I'll pick 20 authors, would win like a $25 gift card to wherever your choice is. What's your thoughts on that? Do you think that'd be kind of cool to add to the show?
Yeah, I mean, I think a game show type idea could be interesting that readers might find it interesting to see, like, what has this author actually read. I don't know that I would do very well because I don't read a lot
That's
of
the
like,
idea.
yeah, I do read things in my genre. So I know most of the big names in my genre. Uh, I am broadly read, but I feel like most of the stuff that I read is probably not stuff that
Would
would
be on the
commonly
list.
come up.
Right. Okay. Well, I was just overall more asking your opinion. Like, do you think that would
Yeah.
be cool? That'd be something you'd want to watch people do? Be like, yo.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to see, especially if it was an author that I'd seen before on the channel or I read their books and I was interested. As you draw in more of us, we hopefully will be sending our readership there, letting our
Exactly.
newsletter subscribers or whatever know, hey, I was featured here, go check this out. So then hopefully, that gets people wanting to come back. And if you were featuring that author, their readers would want to see, oh, well, how did they do?
Right. Exactly. All right. Well, thank you for that answer. I appreciate that. What's the hardest thing about writing for you? Like, what's something that you really struggle with, and how do you go about fixing that issue?
Man, I mean, it's kind of things it's changed over the years. What I started out struggling with is not necessarily what I struggle with now. I think the hardest thing probably about writing fiction specifically would probably be the integration of theme into your works. As an author, personally, I don't believe that there should be any writing where there isn't some sort of a point to it, even if the message is something simple like, you know, it's important to have friends and support group around you. Like it could be something very simple and straightforward or something super complex. I think that every piece of writing needs to communicate some sort of core message or theme behind it, and that can be really difficult to do in writing.
Okay.
It can be difficult to get it across to the reader so that at the end of the book they know exactly what the message was supposed to be, but you weren't preachy about it and like annoying and hitting them over the head with it in a way that's so obvious and annoying. And that balance can be really hard to strike sometimes.
Okay. That makes sense. All right. How do you get ideas for your books aside from like imagination? What sources do you draw from? Is there like any particular author or any like maybe a movie that you like and you say, "Oh man, I really want to write a book about that." Is there anything that you have that does that for you?
I mean, I feel like sometimes there are things like I'll be watching something or reading a book and it will give me a thought, like an element of it will strike something in my subconscious mind going,
Yeah.
and I'll start thinking about like how could I work this into a book. That does happen. I would say that some of it is just from reading broadly as well. I don't necessarily draw inspiration just from like fiction authors necessarily, but also I'm a big history buff. I really enjoy the American founding era, especially, and I
Mhm.
enjoy a lot of like ancient history and philosophy books. So that helps in the sense that like anything from theme to specific story elements or concepts that I want to deal with could be inspired by something that I'm reading or thinking about. Um, so yeah, it's not really from any one particular source. It's more just being observant as I'm going through life and trying to absorb things, understand people, understand or themes and struggles that we deal with in everyday life, and then thinking about how do I put this into a story. For me, it generally starts with the theme. What is it that I want to tell the reader? And then how do I put that into a compelling story with compelling characters that they will care about in order to get that message to them in an entertaining way?
Okay. Great answer. Great answer. How do you go about marketing? And do you find any source of marketing more profitable for you than others?
Goodness. Marketing is probably my least favorite thing about writing because it seems like no matter what you do, it just is like playing Russian roulette. Some things work and some things don't. You never know when you're gonna like have the bullet fire off and
Right.
succeed or fail. And it's frustrating sometimes. I found that like Amazon ads has been a very useful resource for me. Most of the sales that I've made seem to be cold sales and not so much people buying, at least like from my perspective, it's not so many people that seem to have clicked on it from my newsletter and bought, or clicked on it from Facebook and bought, or emailed me to ask to buy a hard copy. It seems like most of it is just people picking it up in Kindle Unlimited or buying the Kindle version or a paperback here and there. So I wouldn't say that sales are necessarily great. Probably part of that is because I do find marketing tedious and I have a hard time with it.
Mhm.
But yeah, I don't know. Amazon ads is probably the best thing that I've found that works. And then
Okay.
just relying on newsletter swaps to try to get more readers' eyes on it, at least.
Okay. All right. As much as you may try not to, right? I'm sure we all do this at least at some point. Do you ever catch yourself like writing in the style of like one of your favorite authors? And if you do, how do you stop yourself from doing that?
That's a good question. I don't know that I really do. Usually, my method of approaching writers that I really enjoy is to look at what they did well. So I'm not so concerned with how they say things precisely.
Hmm.
Although, if they're really good at like metaphorical language and that's something I'm trying to work on, I might observe how they put words together. But
Right.
I'm not necessarily interested in specifically how did this person say it. It's more I when I read to learn at least, I try to give my subconscious mind a conscious order to pay attention to things that I liked about did, how they wrote it, their characters. Then when I find something that I come across and I go, oh, I really like that, then I try to think about why. Why did I like this? What was it that made me stop and go, that was really well done? And then I try to understand what the principles are behind it and apply the principles. So then that way I'm still maintaining my own voice. I don't rate like my favorite authors necessarily. For example, I really enjoy Ayn Rand and Brandon Sanderson, but I wouldn't say that my writing style looks like either one of those authors really. Um,
Okay.
Readers who have read Sanderson's friends have said that they recognize a similarity in my world building to the way that Sanderson world builds because I learned to world build by actively observing how he did it in his work. But it's not really the writing style that remains mine. It's just that they can see the technique in how I drop in my world building with references just to things that happened in the world in the past as if it's got its own history. And then I just move on. Like I don't necessarily dump a whole paragraph in there for you to know about it, but somebody will reference this person or that person who did this or that, and then they're on to the next thing, like we would in normal conversation. Well, I learned to do that with Sanderson. So if you've read a lot of his work and you recognize that technique, it is somewhat unique. You don't see necessarily a lot of fantasy authors who do it quite that way. So then somebody could say, I recognize that technique and that style in that sense.
Okay. Okay. Do you use a pen name? And if you do, why? What's the reason for that?
Yeah, so I think it's probably pretty obvious from my Skype name that yes, I do use a pen name. Um, so I chose to use a pen name really early on before I was even published, actually, because when I first started writing, I wanted to be published, and I was thinking about, do I use a pen name or don't I? And as I was thinking about it at the time, I also wanted to have nonfiction publications out there. And I was probably, I don't know, 10, 12, somewhere in that range when I started thinking of like really being serious about my writing. At that time, it was kind of looked down upon for nonfiction authors to write fiction or for fiction authors to write nonfiction. So the two reading
Why
audience.
is that?
I think honestly what it boiled down to is that readers looked at it as, if you're a fiction author, I don't really trust that you can do the research and you know the first thing about whatever nonfiction subject you're writing about, unless you're writing about writing. Obviously, if you're an author writing about writing, you get a little bit of a leeway there. But if I were to, for example, I'm a fantasy author, but if I were to turn around and write philosophical nonfiction, which is another area I'm very interested in, but it's not at all fantasy related, people might not consider me credible because they'd look at it and go, well, I know you're a fantasy author, so what does a fantasy author know about philosophy?
Okay.
Or vice versa, the people reading your nonfiction look at it and go, why would I want to read your fiction? Surely you can't be a good storyteller, because you write academic. So why would I read your fiction? Maybe that one's a little less common, but the first one is the most common response. It's become less so now, I think, than it used to be. But back when I first started, it was a very big problem. And so I didn't want my legal name to be associated with fiction, because usually when you do academic publishing or nonfiction, it is your legal name.
Okay. If you had one piece of advice, and I think this is a very simple question, but it allows you to think about the best thing that you can teach somebody through this podcast, because my view here is how I started actually this, and to give you a little bit of background, is I was looking up things myself because I'm trying to switch genres. Like I wrote a young adult, like kind of like a horror book. It's about a witch town. Very cool book, but I want to switch into more like a romance kind of supernatural situation. And I noticed that when I was writing, that I was going back to my style of my previous genre, and I didn't know how to really make that difference. So I was looking for something to find, like I was researching things online and saying, okay, how can I not do this? How can I do that? I said, oh my God, I'm going to start a podcast. I'm going to start a podcast so all different types of authors can give their information, that I can go back and watch all the videos and look how much knowledge you can learn just out of the 4 videos I've done thus far.
Right, exactly.
That being said, now I'm giving you the limelight here. What one piece of information you think is absolute best to teach a young author about their work? What is something you wish you knew when you first started?
Okay. So my advice is probably going to reveal the fact that not only am I an author, but I am an English teacher and a bit of a nerd. My advice to young authors is read. Read as broadly and as deeply as you possibly can. So don't just read books that are in your genre. Don't just read fiction if that's what you're writing. Read nonfiction. Read the classics.
Can you say why? Why would that make a difference?
So part of it is that you can grab inspiration from anywhere. Like I was saying earlier, I personally feel like my own writing has become a lot deeper because I understand human nature through studying philosophy and how to create a world that has depth to it by studying history from our world and all the different nuances to that. And the fact that, like, you hear the saying, the victor writes the history books. Okay, so what does the loser have to say? And how can I then, as a fantasy author, use that to build a world that has that same sort of nuance and real feeling to it? And it shows. I've had reviewers who have read it and said, this is fantasy, but it feels more like realistic fiction than some realistic fiction novels I've read. That's because I have that inspiration and that grounding in all different genres in order to bring it into mine. It enriches your writing. It also will teach you more vocabulary, so it will help to expand your ability to write well, just mechanically speaking. It teaches you different storytelling techniques. So when I say read broadly and deeply as well, I don't just mean read passively, because a lot of people will read to enjoy. And so what I hear commonly in a lot of writing groups when they're asking, how do I improve my craft? I tell them, go read the classics. Because as sad as this is, um, there's not a lot of really well-written fiction in the last 50 years. If you really are talking about good craft, there's plenty of fiction that has engaging characters that cause the reader to forget about the fact that the writing and the craft is not great. There are plenty that can craft a decent plot, and if you like plot-driven stories, it might not bother you that the characters are not well fleshed out or that the craft in general, the writing style is kind of bland. But if you really want to understand how do I put a theme into a story in a way that people care about and it says something, how do I craft characters who feel real and raw? How do I craft a plot that brings that theme and those characters together? You're not going to get that in most modern fiction because most modern fiction has sacrificed that idea of theme. They're hyper realistic almost. So you'll get a really great description of daily life, maybe, or a really great description of exactly how they went on this giant quest. But at the end of the day, with most fiction, I find that I'm left wondering what is the point? What was I supposed to learn from this? Where is the reflection on human nature and the deeper meaning? The classics give you that. And if you want to write fiction that is going to hit the reader where it matters and really impact them and them, so they're thinking about it, even if all they're thinking about is messages, long after they've forgotten the character names, you can't learn that from most modern fiction. It doesn't mean there aren't exceptions. There are some really great authors that we do have in modern times, but the majority of it, you're not going to learn it there. And I've seen a lot of authors express frustration over that because they say, I want to learn how to better my craft. And I was told, go read popular fiction, go read things that readers are saying this was a great book. But then they read it and they say, but it's making all of these mistakes in craft. So how am I supposed to learn from this? And my response to those people is, you need to read the classics because if you want to learn craft, that's how you do it. And then you can add all the other trappings of modern fiction that appeals to modern readers later. Not saying you need to write in the style of the classics, because that's
Right.
probably not going to sell. But you learn something valuable reading them. There's a reason that we still consider them classics. And I know a lot of authors, especially new ones, hate it when I say this because they tell me classics are boring. I get this a lot as a teacher and as an author giving other people advice. They say classics are really boring. I hate it. They probably have nightmares from English class in high school, how the teachers, went through Beowulf or something, and it was like really, really boring and boring. Because let's be fair, most high school English teachers don't have the first clue how to teach literature. They don't pull the story out. They don't pull the themes out, the things that make it interesting. Unfortunately, I can't help you if that's been your experience. All I can say is that there is a lot more to the classics than that, if that has been your experience. There are a lot of really interesting ones out there. There are some really dull ones out there. It's still a mixed bag, like any writing is. There's going to be stuff you like and stuff you don't. But my advice is that if you're waiting to learn, make yourself sit there and read it anyway. Make
Okay.
notes about what you don't like. Make notes about why you didn't like it. Don't just note that you didn't. Think critically about the things you do and don't like and use that to help inform you on how you would like to write. So make a list of those things that you liked. Let it sit there. Think about why you liked those things and sort of give your subconscious that conscious note to try to emulate this. Not the specific wording, not the way that the author's voice sounds, but like I was saying earlier, the principles behind what they were doing. Make a note to try to emulate that wherever possible. And then conversely, on the list of things you didn't like, try to understand why you didn't like them and give your subconscious that conscious note, don't do these things.
Okay.
You can learn a lot about your own style of writing and your own preferences through doing that, as well as learn a lot of things about writing that you never would have learned otherwise. I think that reading to learn is one of the best ways to learn to write. It's better than any writing textbook ever will be because you're going to get a more comprehensive view of all of the options out there to form your unique style. So at the end of the day, I think reading is the best thing that I could tell a new author to do, even if it takes time, even if not everything you read is going to be fun. We're not
Right.
here to have it be fun. We're not trying to entertain ourselves, we're trying to learn. There's a difference in those two goals. Read whatever you want on your own time for the heck of it because you like it.
Mhm.
But if you're trying to better your craft, you have to read broadly and deeply and really consciously think about what you're reading.
That's a fantastic answer. I really appreciate that one there. I got a good question for you here. This kind of goes along with that. Maybe it's a little off of that. Okay, let's say you're writing for the day, right? Like I've had this issue myself, and that's how I really generate a lot of these questions because I feel like everybody's going to have access to all these answers now from
Right.
a written author such as yourself. Now, let's say you're writing and you're an hour in for the day, a couple hours in. How do you know that sweet time? Like, you know what? I think right now I'm just rambling. How do you know where that time is where you know the difference has been made that now you're just rambling to where you were writing quality content? Does that make sense?
Goodness. Yeah, it does. It's been a long time since I have found myself just rambling. I'm a plotter. I wasn't when I first started, and that was where I did have those times where I wasn't saying anything worth saying on the page. Usually because I had no idea where I was going next. The
Mhm.
outline, even if all it is just a couple of sentences about what needs to happen in the chapter in order to keep the plot moving forward towards the conclusion I need it to get to,
Right.
really helps keep me on track. So for me now, it's more about paying attention to when my attention is wandering. Because if I am not focused, I'm a ghostwriter as well on the side. So for me, I get paid a certain amount per word.
Can you explain ghostwriting?
Yeah, so it's basically where an author or a publishing mill, so people who put out a lot of books in very short order, they hire an author or just a writer. You know, they don't necessarily always hire somebody who's already been published or self-published, but they do prefer that. They hire you to do the writing for them. So they tell you, they might give you a plot, or some of them, most of mine, just tell me, here are the tropes for the genre, and here's a general idea of what I'd like you to write about in this book. Write me up a plot outline chapter by chapter. Give me a sample of the first chapter, and then once that's approved, setting you loose, go ahead and write the rest of the book. And then I get paid for it. My name doesn't go on it. I have nothing to do with any of the marketing or what happens with the book afterwards. They pay me their product, they do whatever they want. And I'm good with that. You know, they take it and go. That helps pay the bills. You know, I know some people have very strong opinions about whether or not ghostwriting is a good thing. For me, I rely on it to help pay bills. So I'm not really against it, especially since, like, what do I care whether or not somebody is using a pen name for a corporation where they hired writers, or they're the actual author? I don't care as long as the book is good and I'm being entertained. Um,
Right.
but as a ghostwriter, since I am paid by the word and not by my time spent, it's imperative that I do not spend time sitting there doing nothing. So if I've got the timer running for 15 minutes, I need to be writing for that 15 minutes, and I need to be writing as fast as possible while maintaining quality. And so I've got to be really focused.
Tough.
It is. It can be very difficult. But that said, what I've found is that if I've hit a point where I'm under about 700 words in 15 minutes, I need to walk away. because I'm at that point then tanking my per hour rate on the project. And
So you
obviously for my
would be
own writing,
cutting into your profit?
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. You said so at that point you'd like basically be cutting into your profit and wasting your time.
Right, because essentially if I'm going below 700 words in 15 minutes, since I'm paid by the word, um, I calculate my hourly rate by saying, here's how much I make total on the project. And
Okay.
then here's how much the platform that I use to find clients takes out of it as a commission. That gives me the amount I'm going to make on the project at the end.
Right.
Base, assuming that I'm exactly the work count they expected. But
Mm-hmm.
then I also keep track of how much time I've spent. And I take the amount that I'm getting paid for the project total and divide it by the number of hours that I've spent by the end of the project. And my goal is to keep it anywhere from $28 to $30 an hour. If if I'm getting below like $20 an hour, then that is less than I make at my part-time seamstressing job. So my concept is like, okay, I'm not going to waste my time on something that's going to make me less than that. So at that point, then it's better for me to step away, take a little bit of a break, go do something else, and come back to it mentally refreshed and able to focus than it is to sit there, force myself to work through it, and think how much I'm making in an hour. Unless I'm on a really tight deadline, I try to pay attention to that. Try to just say, okay, I can't focus. So I'm going to go do something else for 10 minutes or something, or go to the store, run an errand, come back to it later.
Okay. Okay. I got another good question for you here. It's probably one of the last ones before I wrap up. I've noticed a lot of people lately because I've been paying attention to a lot of the feeds, right, in all the writing groups
Right.
on what people are having problems with, and what type of questions can I ask the people that are going to be on my show to help fix these problems, or at least help people along. Obviously, you ain't going to fix everything, right? But I've noticed a lot of people, whether it's paid or not, actually, believe it or not, are having a tough time getting reviews for their books, whether it be on Amazon or Barnes and Noble, whatever. Do you have any, I don't know, quirks or anything that you can help people and say, hey, you want to get reviews? Do this. Is there anything that's out there like that?
There are different review services out there. You have to be really careful because of Amazon's terms of service, obviously.
What does that mean?
So
why to be careful?
Yeah. So if you are on Amazon, and I don't know if all the other publishing platforms have these same rules, but I'm exclusive to Amazon, so that's what I know. Amazon has rules surrounding what counts as a valid review and what doesn't. And so if you violate those rules, there are varying levels of penalties that they will inflict upon you and the person involved as the reviewer if they find out about it. So a couple of the major rules are that you cannot have friends or family review the book. It used to be that you could. They stopped doing that probably because their goal was to make sure it's as many real like clients or readers as possible so that you're getting real customer reviews, not just, your Aunt Sally saying the book was great because they're biased, like
Right.
maybe they're being honest, maybe they're not, we don't know.
I get the point, but in another sense, that's kind of not fair.
It is frustrating because it's like, I could have, there's so many people in my community that I could ask, but now I can't because I know you.
Right.
So you can ask other authors. There's a joke that goes around in the ad group that I'm in that Amazon's terms of service on this stuff are about as clear as mud. Yeah, they're not super helpful. But generally, the rule of thumb is that if you're going to ask another author that you know to help review, just don't swap review for review because that can get you in trouble. So make sure you allow a good chunk of time between. So if you are going to swap reviews, don't do it at the same time. Like, don't say, you read my book, I'll read yours. We'll both review, because that will get you in trouble.
Right.
But it doesn't seem like it will necessarily get you in trouble if, I have a release this month, say, and I ask you to review it, you review it. And then a couple months later, you have a release, you ask me to review it, and I review it. That's less likely to get you in trouble.
Okay.
Because it's not like you're essentially like exchanging the reviews. It's more just helped another out.
Okay.
So it's a little tricky. I don't like to play games with it. I will review for authors that I know if I haven't asked them to do something of the sort with me recently.
Right.
But I like to give time. Another thing is that you cannot pay for the reviews. So that one will get a lot of people in
Paid
trouble.
review services, though? I've seen them.
So that's where it gets a little tricky. You can pay for a review service like Booksprout, for example, which is what I use.
Okay.
You can pay the service as a platform to put you in touch with reviewers, whom you then give a free copy of the book to in exchange for an honest review. You can do that.
Okay.
But what you can't do is pay, say, a service that has a panel of reviewers. They get paid and they give it to a reviewer specifically and say, you're reviewing this. Like, that you can't do. So essentially, you cannot compensate the reviewer for it. You could pay a platform that brings you two together in order to facilitate finding the reviewers. But you cannot pay the reviewer for it. And the reviewers cannot be in any way, shape, or form paid by the platform either. If Amazon catches you doing that, then you will get in trouble. Any reviewer worth their salt offering to review your book should know those rules if they're offering to review on Amazon, because they can get their reviewing privileges revoked if they're caught. And Amazon will remove the review and could potentially remove all of your reviews on the entire book if they choose. They're not real clear on what the guidance is on when they do that and when they don't. So I don't like to mess with that because they're kind of arbitrary. We get treated like the ugly red stepchild. So, like, it's not funny. They will do. So just don't mess with it.
Okay.
So yeah, but you can legitimately use like services like Booksprout, which is what I use, and that does seem to be okay. I can't promise you that the reviewers are actually going to review. That's kind of part of the game, is that because you can't pay them for it, all you can do is offer a copy of the book and kind of hope they review. You have a higher rate of review if you go through something like Booksprout, but at the end of the day, if they don't review, they don't review. So I've had ones where I had like 7 people sign up and only 3 of them actually reviewed.
Oh, wow.
Usually it's a higher percentage than that, but I have had some where that's happened. So you can't really control it. There's not a lot you can do. You just kind of got to hope that the person's honest.
All right. Well, I think we've had a fantastic podcast. I really appreciate all the information you brought to the table today. And maybe I will contact you if you'd be interested in doing the game show type one. I'm trying to set that up with Mariah now. So,
okay.
Thank you very much for being on the show. I will have this spun down and I will send it over to you as soon as I do.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Have a good night.
You too. Bye.